All right, coach. First of all, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, sure. My name is Randy Sullivan. I'm a physical therapist and a certified strength and conditioning specialist, and I'm the owner and CEO of the Florida Baseball Armory. It's a training facility here in Lakeland, Florida, and we specialize in training throwing athletes.
I know, I know, on your Instagram page, you post a lot of how the how you train pictures. I know it's a lot different than what we what we used to see as strength and conditioning. So can you explain a little how did you start this kind of approach and why?
Okay, well, the whole thing started because my son, I was a baseball player in college, and my oldest of three sons was a left-handed pitcher, and he was really good, but he sat around 79 to 81 miles an hour. And when it came time to get out of high school and play in college, he didn't throw hard enough to get recruited. And so we had to figure out how to throw harder. Everyone we talked to in the baseball world said, you can't learn to throw harder, it's a gift. And I thought, that can't be right. I'm a physical therapist. This is a movement. I teach people to move every day. If I can teach someone who just had a stroke to walk again, we may be able to squeeze a couple miles an hour out of my son. So we had to kind of begin to investigate a different route because the status quo wasn't working for him and a lot of other guys just like him. And so we thought we got to find a way to do this. And so um, went down this path that took us far and wide. And then I was out at the Texas Baseball Ranch for a coaching conference in 2014, and I heard a speaker named Frans Bosch from the Netherlands. And he started introducing me to this idea of ecological dynamics and dynamic systems theory and a different way to approach movement and training. Um, Franz came from the track and field and rugby world. And so I came home and started researching his ideas, and we were able to connect. I was invited over to the Netherlands to work with their national team and some of their national program players. And I developed a relationship with Franz and Martijn Nijhoff and Bart Hanegraaff and a few others over there. And we began to sort of figure out, how do we apply this system to baseball? How do we apply this process to baseball? Then got really deep into studying ecological dynamics. Rob Gray from Arizona State University became a really good friend. And I began writing and researching about that and applying it to players around here. And, looking up guys just started getting better. We took a different approach to it. It's a movement-based approach. It's what's known as ecological dynamics, which is a combination of ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory, which just posits that, um, first of all, that organisms move in response to the information they gather from their environment directly. There's no need to interpret the information. The information in the environment is robust enough that we can use the information we gather through our senses to move without thinking. And then the other part of it is dynamic systems theory, which basically says that there are no linear relationships in complex systems. Right, the body is a complex system, like the weather, like an economy, like a frog pond, where all the variables interact in such a way that if you change one thing, everything changes almost unpredictably. And so what you have to do is you have to find these universal movement principles, these stabilizing system parts of the system known as attractors. And Franz was able to identify a lot of those in athletics, in agility. He wrote a really uh, forward-leaning book called Anatomy of Agility, which basically identified 12 universal movement principles that govern every movement in high intensity sport. There you go. that's that's the one, right? It's on my desk too, and I refer to it all the time. And basically, we took his 12 universal principles, kind of condensed them into eight, and then began to apply them to our throwers and our hitters. And the results were incredible. It's been a phenomenal way to do it because I think the key is, while others are focused on technique and mechanics, we kind of release the athlete to explore his own athleticism by just looking at these eight universal principles called attractors. People get confused by that sometimes. An instructor I was training a few months ago said, "Oh, you guys focus on the big rocks, not the pebbles." I'm like, "Well, okay, a little oversimplified, but we'll go with that." And so basically, while everyone is worrying about style and details, we zoom out from the style and the details that most people call mechanics and lock in on these universal principles and train those principles. And once we begin to build that foundation, the athlete is free to express his own athleticism in his own unique way. And it's been incredible to watch our guys grow and progress down that path.
Cool. So, uh, I know like you mentioned like dynamic system theory
Mm-hmm.
and ecological. What is it called?
Ecological dynamics. Yeah.
So can I understand this way? The dynamic system theory is basically using the environment as a cue to help athlete perform instead of like us teaching them.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Instead of telling them how to move, in traditional coaching, I have another acronym that I use called TWIT coaching, TWIT. And I'm not disparaging anyone. I'm a recovering twit. Okay. In traditional coaching, we tend to tell the athlete what to do, watch him do it, inform him of everything he's done wrong, and then tell him how to do it better. And that's not really how we learn movement skills. We learn movement skills through experience. Okay. And so in our approach, instead of telling the athlete what to do, we become the architects of their environment. And then we manipulate the information, what they get through their senses, and that information changes the way they move. And that's the ecological side of dynamic systems theory, is the theory of direct perception, that we don't have to go through the brain, that we can just manipulate the environment, the task, the athlete, and the environment, and manipulate the situation, set up an environment where the body is encouraged to explore movement solutions to problems that we present.
So is that the same with constraint-led approach?
Constraints-led approach. Yeah, I wrote a book with Rob Gray. He's an associate professor at Arizona State University and a leading researcher in this ecological dynamics, which is basically behavioral psychology and how we learn to move. And Rob has written more in the baseball world than anyone else on this topic. Um, and we wrote a book called A Constraints-Led Approach to Baseball Coaching. And basically, in this approach, instead of creating sort of fabricated or rehearsed movement patterns, we just constrain the environment, the task, or the athlete in a way that encourages them to find a family of movement solutions. One of the founding principles is that repetition of a single movement is impossible. That's Nikolai Bernstein, the father of motor learning, right? Repetition without repetition, you can't repeat a movement. You can't even make a single joint move 2 times in a row the same way, let alone coordinate your ankles, knees, hips, torso, shoulder, elbow, wrist, and hand, and everything that needs to go along with a typical throw, for example. And so instead of repeating it, high performers are really great at making subconscious adjustments to the movement as they go. It's called covariation. Like for a pitcher, when he lifts his leg, his ankle does something different every time. And his knee has to make an adjustment for that. And then his hip has to control that. And then he goes all the way out to his hand till we get a repeatable outcome. But the pathway there is not the same every time. And so what we understand in this approach is that the body isn't looking for a single optimal solution to the movement problem. It is looking for a family of reasonable solutions that it can use in any situation. And so in the constraints-led approach, what we do is we just, in a nutshell, and the easy way to describe it is we have to set up a training scenario so that either the athlete is constrained or inhibited from doing the things that we think might be disrupting the movement or destabilizing those attractors, if you will, or constrain it in such a way that it encourages him to explore other options so that he finds new affordances, new solutions to the problem, so that he begins to like much better. So, and it's a creative way of coaching without going through the brain. It's called implicit learning, and it's done by a lot less talking and a lot more set up the environment, let the athlete explore and get out of the way, right? I think that one of the issues we get into with traditional coaching is coaches like to coach, and we love to help players. And that eerie silence between repetitions, we feel like we need to fill it with some sort of cue, some sort of instruction. And what we understand is that if we just remain quiet and stay out of the way, and maybe instead of giving feedback on every repetition, delay it a little bit and group it and go, and look for trends instead of specific details. Then the athlete begins to learn through the errors they make. They explore, their body recalibrates, and they learn the movement solution. In our process, the sweet spot for learning is we want about 60 to 70% success rate. So we try to encourage our guys to explore. We want failure. We want them to make errors in the gym. We want them to have not clean reps. We want them to not have perfect performance about 30 to 40% of the time, because they learn during those mistakes. Their body learns to recalibrate, and the body's incredibly wise and intelligent. And if we just get out of the way and let it do its thing, it's amazing what they can accomplish.
Yeah. So, you talk about in the anatomy of agility, there's like 12 rules to find a tractor, and you can narrow it down. Can you walk us through like the 8 rules you're gonna use?
Sure. It starts in the pelvis. For us, the pelvis is the center of the universe. So, we have to control the pelvis in 3 planes. We have to control it in the frontal plane like this with the lateral tilt. We have to control the sagittal plane, and we have to control the transverse plane. And we control the frontal plane with something we call rotation around the hip, or the hip hinge. When we get into a slight hinge on our first move, the gluteus medius and minimus over here, grab the pelvis and tilt it in the frontal plane. And we have this really cool Newt force sensored mound, 14,000 pressure sensors, and it gives us ground reaction force data during a pitch, linked with real-time video. It's an amazing tool that we use. And we had the second one in the world. The inventor asked us, Kyle Barker asked us to figure out what it meant. So we ran an epic study on it. We ran 500 pitchers through our place. We named 22 data points on the graph that it presented, and we had the radar gun reading and 22 data points on these 500 pitches. And we ran a machine learning algorithm to let us rank them relative to their influence on velocity. The number one influencer of velocity after the athlete's weight, up to about 180 pounds, was this measure of how much force you can create towards second base and how long you can hold that force. We call that impulse. And the way we realize you have to maintain impulse is to keep the pelvis slightly tilted by engaging the muscles of the back hip in an isometric hinge called a co-contraction, where everything is on and you're holding the pelvis tilted. Now, ironically, that was the first influencer, was how long you can hold the rearward force. The second influencer was how fast you're moving down the mound. So what we found is you have to hold rearward force by moving forward fast, and the only way you can do that is by taking advantage of isometrics around the back hip. And then once we get there, we have to rotate the back femur and rotate around that hinge, and that's the number one influence. It's called rotation around the hip. Number two is controlling the sagittal plane, respecting the sagittal plane. So we can't while you're trying to rotate, you can't let the pelvis dump backwards or forwards. And number three is controlling transverse plane rotation of the pelvis. We control the trail hip. We think of the pelvis as having a back door and a front door. So if I'm a right-hander, this is my back hip. We control the back hip with something called a hip lock. It's a term that Franz coined in the running world. It's basically the calf is extended, the ankle's extended, the knee is extended, the hip is extended, and all the muscles around the hip are on in an isometric co-contraction. And that pulls the back of the pelvis rearward and keeps it from rotating forward, delays it a little bit, which for us begins to give the abdominals their sweet spot of stretch to help them perform optimally at their optimal length. And so that's the hip lock on the back. We go from the rotation of the back hip into a hip lock. And then we have to close the front of the pelvis, keeping it from spinning this way. And there what we have to do is we have to co-contract all the muscles on the lead hip and stop the pelvis from spinning that way. So that's the first four, which involve the pelvis, rotation around the hip hinge, respecting the sagittal plane while rotating, hip lock, and closure of the pelvis when you're rotating. And then we have proximal and distal action movements after we emerge from the pelvis outward. And then we have getting your chest out while you rotate. Chest out while rotating is thoracic extension as we go to rotate, not lumbar extension. Basically, the vertebrae that have ribs attached to them, we need to extend the thoracic spine while we rotate, while maintaining stability in the lumbar spine and cervical spine. And then rotation around the shoulder is one that I added to the list for throwers because, you know, the hip and the shoulder are both ball and socket joints. The hip is a deep socket with a big ball. It's pretty easy to keep the hip in the center. The shoulder sits on there like a golf ball sitting on a tee, and so it needs muscles to hold it on, and the muscles are the rotator cuff, one in the front, one in the top, two in the back. When the front foot hits the ground and the athlete rotates his back hip and gets his chest out, those muscles have to co-contract to hold the head of the humerus in the socket, in the clinoid. And then we have keeping the head still. You can't let the head bob up and down. It can't jerk when it moves, and it can't bob up and down on this vertical plane. It needs to stay on plane. And so those 8 attractors are a derivative of the original 11 or 12 that Franz wrote in his book. And those are sort of applied to pitching and hitting for us. And what we do is basically when we assess, rather than look at mechanics, we just look at, are they able to accomplish and stabilize those attractors within those conditions? And the neat thing about attractors is they're not specific to joint motions or angles or positions that people typically lock in on. They're more abstract principles, and they govern all movement. And so we look at, can they accomplish these attractors? And then instead of working on the details of the mechanics, we can zoom out and work on learning to move in that manner. So we spend a lot of our time away from the skill, learning to do things like hip hinges and hip locks and closing the front door of the pelvis. Not so much time, repping it out. One of the limiting factors in many sports, and especially baseball, is that you just can't throw enough to get great at it, right? You can't just, if you're a high jumper, you can't high jump enough to get great at high jumping. If you're a sprinter, you can't sprint enough to get great at sprinting. We can't throw enough to get great at throwing. And so what we do is we find out where they're unstable in these movement principles, these attractors, and then we attack those with a constraints-led approach. We just decide, okay, where is the error happening? And then we lock in on that attractor that's the closest to the error and perturb it, agitate it, disrupt it, and make it find stability.
Nice, nice. So I know that uh for me, like the biomechanic, if you understand movement, a lot of like attractor, like you mentioned, no matter it's like hip lock, rotation around the hip, or force closure, it makes sense if you understand movement. So I kind of like don't understand like uh how is it did it match with biomechanic?
Well, yes and no. So one of the things that makes these attractors universal is they're built around the principles of anatomy and these universal conditions, not positions, but conditions of agility. And so every skill that you perform is just a different version of agility, right? And when you're performing that skill, your anatomy didn't change. It's the same, okay? So does it match with biomechanics? To some degree. But one of the problems that we see with biomechanics, and Franz Bosch says this a lot, is that there's very little bio in biomechanics. We use a lot of motion capture in baseball, right? And that's become the rage. And it's a great tool, and it gives us information about what's happening internally. But the assumption is that the sensors we use in motion capture are telling us truly what the body is doing. And in fact, the sensors are telling us what the sensors are doing. And we make this inferential leap that that's what's happening internally. But the sensors can't tell us about the internal microscopic self-organization that occurs. So we can measure this stuff on the outside, and it gives us sort of an inference as to what is happening inside, but it isn't truly addressing the internal self organization. And so while biomechanics is really helpful, we have to remember that we are not made of metal and rivets, and we don't follow the laws of Newtonian physics because we have this living adaptable tissue in us that adapts to every from the microscopic level, adapts to every sensory input that it receives. And so we just have to respect that while we can measure a lot of really neat things with biomechanics now, we have to be careful that we don't fall prey to the idea that when you can't measure what's truly important, you tend to make what you can measure seem much more important than it is. And so there's value to biomechanics, um, especially when it considers the bio part a little more deeply, when it just appreciates that, okay, I can come up with these ideas or these metrics that will give me sort of an idea of what might be happening inside, but we have to respect that each athlete's going to organize internally differently. And so we can't just lay down a set of numbers and say you have to meet these metrics because physics says you have to. For example, let's say we're throwing and we have motion capture sensors on the elbow, right? And the sensors tell us, based on the algorithms that the biomechanics have solved there, that this athlete has 70 Newton meters of torque on his elbow. And we think that's a little dangerous. Well, what we don't appreciate is that at a particular moment in time, his muscles can contract in a coordinated fashion to attenuate that force. So 70 Newton meters of torque on his elbow might not be as impactful as 70 Newton meters of torque on another elbow because of his ability to coordinate control through dynamic muscle contractions that we can't yet measure. Okay. So while it may be good to compare one athlete as his own control group to himself the next day or the next day or the next day to see if there are any red flags that come up, like why is this number different? We can't really cast this wide net and go, okay, everyone needs to fall within these ranges to be a highly performing athlete and to remain safe and healthy. That is a flawed approach, and that gives us what we call the cult of average, where we just kind of get the line of linear regression, and everybody has to fit within that range. And we have some people that could do way more, and some people that shouldn't be even trying to do what we're trying to do. So
That's true. That's perfect example. I like it. So I know you mentioned uh when you found out maybe someone's like um foul in their movement, you're gonna you're gonna maybe use the nearest extractor to train it to correct
right.
it. So uh those exercise always seems like kind of difficult to understand, or from an outsider I kind of find it difficult to like design it myself. So
Mm-hmm.
can you explain a little, like, or walk us through your thought process of like uh after you found like which attractors, like which athletes should work on which attractor, how did you design those movements?
Well, a big breakthrough came when Dutch strength coach Paul Vinner came up with this idea that he calls the three P's that we in English we translate it to PUT, pretension. We use pretension, um, time pressure, and unpredictable loads. Okay, so we basically immerse them in this environment that either uses pretension, time pressure, or unpredictable loads to elicit these little microscopic isometric co-contractions that stabilize the movement. Okay. Um, Pretension, sometimes like a lioness pouncing on a prey, can take this slack out manually. An easy example for us is when the athlete lifts their lead leg to throw. We just ask them to keep their leg to some degree of tone, some tension in it, so that when it lands, there's no delay in turning it on. Time pressure, when the body doesn't have time to organize, it reverts to its reflex of isometric co-contraction, meaning all the muscles around tense up. So think about your fight or flight response. When you're scared or startled and don't have time to figure out what to do, your first thing is to take the slack out of the system with isometrics. And then, so we do a lot of things where we ask the athlete to move real fast, switch from foot to foot, from side to side, from arm to arm, from body part to body part really quickly. So we use a lot of time pressure. And then unpredictable loads. When the body's exposed to an unpredictable load, it controls the forces by reverting to isometric co-contractions. And that's where they came up with these wonderful aqua bags and aqua balls that have been, Paul Vinner was the first one to do it, and it's kind of been knocked off by a lot of people since then. And we use all these aqua products because the water is unpredictable, and when you're shaking it around, the only way to control it is to perform isometrics to stabilize it. Okay. Now, the thing is, it's not like a bodybuilder's isometrics where we just tense everything up. These are little microscopic isometrics that pass on in a coordinated manner from one to another, and so we just use those as our primary stimulus, and then we just creatively come up with exercises that challenge hip blocks, hip hinges, closing the pelvis, form and force closure of the pelvis. Really work hard on time pressure in the abdominals. In pitching especially, it's a really low intensity activity that transitions to an incredibly high intensity activity, and so the transition point is the pelvis. And so the abdominals, their job is to transfer energy from the lower half to the upper half. And because of their anatomical design, their bandwidth for optimal length is very narrow. So we call them the divas of the system. And so if you overstretch them in the frontal plane or understretch them, overstretch them in the transverse plane or understretch them, overstretch them in the sagittal plane or understretch them, they're not going to be as helpful in transferring energy. So you have to take care of those planes. And so you got to find that Goldilocks place for each athlete and let them explore. And so we use a lot of time pressure and unpredictable loads to challenge the abdominals to get them to find stability. The interesting thing is that, this is Mark Latache, Penn State University guru. He's a brilliant motor learning scientist. And he wrote deeply on something called the equilibrium point hypothesis, which basically talks about how there's this place of readiness that every muscle has. Everybody talks about optimal length. We kind of know what that is. Every muscle has a sweet spot at which it works the best in its length. There's also this place of readiness based on the tone of the muscle, the electrical readiness, if you will, where it is, it's on the ascending limb of the length tension curve, and hovering around that optimal length is this point at which the muscle is ready to fire the most. And that's called the equilibrium point. And the body's in this struggle to maintain a certain bandwidth close to that readiness state. You have to be kind of ready to move all the time. But when you get outside of that bandwidth, if you find isometric conditions, the body senses that equilibrium point has been established. Okay, and so we kind of work on the edges of the movement and teach the body to find isometric co-contractions at the edges of the movement so they can stabilize the movement no matter where it finds itself. In baseball pitching, it's not a highly variable activity. It's just a narrow bandwidth of variability. Hitting is a little bit more variable. Obviously, rugby and soccer, incredibly variable. In a football player, American football player has to learn to find stability in hip hinge, co-contract around, and then do that while a 300-pound guy is trying to tackle him. So the amount of variability you need in sports like that is really much greater than what we have in baseball pitching. And so we have to sort of scale that to the demands of the sport, right? Like we don't need a ton of variability in our pitching, just enough. But in skills of more dynamic athleticism, like football and rugby and soccer, we have to really work the edges of the movement and try to find stability even when things are bad, right? So I think of every move in any sport as a rundown. Let's say the luge in the Winter Olympics, like the one-man rocket sled. The guy jumps in the rocket sled, goes on the ice tunnel. The winner with the fastest time makes the best adjustments. The loser loses stability on the turns, trying to make the adjustments, and he doesn't make them as rapidly. In baseball, the tunnel is very, it's not it's not highly variable, but in other sports, it's really variable. And so we need this big bandwidth of variability, unpredictable loads, instability at the edges of the movement, at the edges of those attractors. And as the skill gets more defined and more closed, if you will, uh, then you don't need as much variability to challenge the movement. And so, we've been able to work with players in all sports applying these principles. We work with professional golfers, NFL quarterbacks, beach volleyball players, tennis players, American football players, rugby players, soccer players. And basically, you just have to analyze the skill and see how much variability we need and what kind of movements do I need to be able to achieve and where do I have to find stability in those. And then you create a scenario where you challenge those movements.
Cool. I know that like different coaches would have different way to like implement quote unquote French ball system.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talked to John Pryor, he trained rugby athletes.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Mm-hmm.
was like sometimes he's still gonna use those like heavy lifting. Correct me if
Yeah.
I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah.
And in your situation, like do you still like maybe single leg or double bilateral squat heavy, power clean, all those stuff?
To a degree, sometimes. Okay. I think that each athlete reaches a point where the diminishing returns of that is there. In rugby, John Pryor has to have mass. He needs people that have mass and can handle very, very large forces. In baseball and pitching, it's not that bad. It's not as much, right? So when I compare what John Pryor's rugby athletes have to do with their legs compared to what a pitcher has to do with his legs or her legs, in pitching, the purpose of the legs is to properly position the pelvis. There's not a high demand, and so the return on training time for just banging out heavy squats and RDLs and cleans and things like that, maybe it isn't there because the magic happens above the pelvis, right? Um, and so as long as the athlete is strong enough to properly position his pelvis and stabilize it, I don't think that we get a return on the training time that is of great value when we continue to pound the legs to try to get stronger legs for pitcher. I think a lot of people fall prey to that myth. And when they do, it's, you know, there could be some negative consequences to overtraining that. I think that is pretty far down the continuum. Like, obviously, if there's injury risk, uh, we've probably overdone it. But the big thing for me is, you know, there are potential negative consequences in things like rate of force development and things like that. But for me, it's just a return on training time problem. Like, I get 86,400 seconds every day. I have to make mine more productive than everybody else. And so if I'm a baseball pitcher, I think that diving deeper into my 500-pound deadlift isn't the most valuable return on my training time. So,
So, uh, can I understand it this way? You still squat the maybe still squat them, maybe
we do.
still deadlift, but reach to a certain point you think that's strong enough. Maybe that's maybe not like two times body weight. It depends on the athlete, but after that, go back to like correcting stuff they need to correct at the moment. Am I right?
Yeah, and I don't think it needs to be a yes or no. I don't think you need to stay, okay, hey, we've reached the point where we're strong enough. We can stop doing that and we can start doing these. We do them all integrated all the way throughout. So we have a guy, let's say we have a guy who's just really weak, an 11-year-old who just not strong, okay? Or a 16-year-old high school kid who's scrawny and 150 pounds and needs to get stronger, right? We go to traditional strength training on that. But we do sort of a hybrid where we do what we call our metal lifting, which is traditional strength training that you see in the strength conditioning world. But then we also add in some of these challenges using unpredictable loads as well, and you can blend that really well. And in fact, Louis Simmons and Westside Barbell was notorious for using unpredictable loads to break through plateaus. Right, when they got stuck, he'd start hanging weights from elastic bands, and the weight would be unpredictable. And through perturbing that system, he was able to break through plateaus in the strength world. So it's not that you only have to use the aqua bags and aqua balls. You can use anything that creates an unpredictable stimulus. And I think that when you dig deep, I don't know that we have time for this today, but we dig deep into the concept of biotensegrity, and how the body's just finding stability in its microsystems, that when you offer unpredictable loads, when a muscle reaches an isometric condition, it bulges radially. And that bulging creates pressure gradients within the fascia, which is microscopically interwoven into every tissue. And the way I look at it is that that fascia, those fascial links become this soup can string that the body uses to communicate intramuscularly. And so internally, if we have slack in the system, the the radios don't work and we can't talk to each other microscopically. And so removing slack through isometrics is the best way to maintain the stability of the system. So it helps us improve our power through force sharing. More muscles can work to do the same job instead of isolating muscles. It helps improve our coordination because the essence of coordination is muscles communicating and knowing when to turn on and when to turn off, when to be on more and when to be on less. And with slack through the fascia, they can't communicate through these pressure gradients. And it also provides a level of protection because the body doesn't wander off into places that it can't control. It doesn't get exposed to shear forces that it can't control. And so power control and protection are the result of synchronized microscopic isometric co-contractions that spread out throughout the body and create stability in the whole system. And that brings us back to the beginning of that dynamic systems theory, that all these variables are interacting all the time and you can't isolate them. So you have to create an environment that challenges that system to perform its magic.
So, do you like, if I'm gonna like really categorize it, would you put like uh these movement, no matter it's aqua ball, perturbation, whatever you
Mm-hmm.
ball you use, would you put on probably put it on before the weightlifting while the brain is fresh, so the body, the brain can learn new skill, or would you put it after maybe strength training? I know it depends, but like,
No, it doesn't depend. It is, the answer is yes. Before, during, and after. Like mix it up, right? Because the body has to perform in all different states of fatigue. So we have a lot of issues like pitchers only want to pitch and practice when they're at their peak period. They want to perform really well in their practice session on the bullpen. And so to get a guy to go work out in the gym and then come throw his bullpen is like, oh my gosh, no, I want to work. I want to throw first. Well, sometimes in the game you're fatigued, you know? And so, when we talk about the constraints-led approach, Carl Newell's triangle is the environment, the task, and the organism, the athlete. One way that you can create adaptations is to manipulate the athlete, and that's overlooked. Like get the athlete fatigued and then have him perform the skill. Um, and so and so different varying states of fatigue that adds the variability that we need to get the adaptations that we want. So yeah, I would put it everywhere. I would mix it in. We actually, for us, one thing we're trying to eliminate. I was working with a major league team just last week, and we have to eliminate this siloing that skill and strength are different. Skill, strength, and rehab are different categories, right? If we can rally around the attractors now, first of all, everybody's speaking the same language and addressing the same issues that we've evaluated, and we don't have this siloing anymore where you have your strength people and then you have the strength people only work on strength and the skill people only work on skill and the rehab people only work on rehab. Everybody's integrated and now everybody's working together on the same stuff. And so for us, it's really hard to define the difference between strength and skill, right? Because our performance director Alan Kolb, he is in charge of our strength department, if you will, but he also runs the bullpens, right? And and we might do a lift and then go do a throwing drill right after, integrate it all. Like, okay, on our skill, our pitching coordinator might be in the bullpen with an athlete and seeing that he's spinning off, he can't close the front door. Take him off the mound, grab an aqua bag, do some step downs with chops across his front hip to learn to close the front door, perturb it with a water bag, get back up on the mound and throw the pitch and see if we can integrate that. And so it's really kind of blended throughout, and it's everywhere, and it's for every age too. I just got an email from a young lady who's a mother who said she wanted to know if it was better to wait until later to get started. I'm like, get started now, right? The thing about this approach is that because it's individualized, it can be easily scaled to every single athlete's individual age, maturity, ability level. And so really easy to scale it and individualize it when you rally around these 8 attractors, because all you have to do is look, okay, you can't stabilize the back hip. Let's get working on that. Let's see if we can challenge that and find ways to do it that match the guy's ability and skill. You can regress it and progress it just like you would in traditional strength. And the thing is, when we're using unpredictable as the load, a lot of times in strength training, when you progress or regress an exercise, it's really you use load as the measuring force. Like add more load to progress it, take away load. But load is always thought of as weight, right? When we think of load also as variability or unpredictability, now it opens up a whole new universe of activities. I can add load by adding unpredictability. I can also add load by adding complexity to the exercise. I can add phase transitions between attractors. I can go from the back hip to the front hip. Instead of isolating them, you can work on integrating them. And you really have to do that eventually, is put them all together.
Cool. So, for at the beginning you mentioned it was your son was trying to throw faster. Then after
Mhm.
this, how like like how fast after this approach or after this like training method, how fast did it went? And like, do you find there's like a lot improvement after you implement after like you use this kind of approach?
Yeah, we've seen some incredible gains. Some of them happen really quickly, and some of them happen over time. But the ones that stick with it make progress. My son's personal journey. He graduated from high school. We started down this path after he graduated, and he went to junior college for 2 years. And after 2 years of junior college, he had gone from 79 to 93 miles per hour at his max, and sat around 90, 89, 90. We've had guys. We just had Camden Manassi, who's with the Angels now, started in the ninth grade and was at 68 miles an hour. Has been doing it with us now for 8 years. Now his on ramping bullpen, he's touching 100 now. So we've had guys make some incredible progress. Sometimes it happens quick, and sometimes it's a slow burn. It just kind of grinds, and it's not linear. They go forward, they go sideways, they go backwards, and we just follow them along on the journey. And the thing that you have to really be conscious of is monotony, right? Not just the boredom psychologically, but the body gets accommodated to a stimulus and it no longer adapts. And so in variability, constantly per change, we perturb the attractor, but the stimulus is constantly changing. And so we have to, even when things are going well, every so often we have to take away the old drills and exercises and add new ones. And same, it's called, Rob Gray calls it converging constraints, where we're getting to the same endpoint, but we're getting there different ways all the time. And so, like, let's say we have a guy who's working on rotating around his hip on the back leg. We might have 8 to 10 different things that he does. Some things in the mound with throwing skill work, some things in the gym. And we'll do those things, and the body's adapting really well. He's getting better at it. But after about a month, we shake it up and go, all right, here you can, of those 8, you can keep 3. We're going to add 5 new ones. Okay. Um, Logan Gilbert is a major leaguer that's been with us since the ninth grade, and he's an elite Major League Baseball player. And he calls us every month and says, hey, okay, I need a new plan because I've been doing this for a month. He's learned in 3 years of Major League Baseball that if we just do the same thing the entire season, the body gets stale and the stimulus no longer has impact. And so he's learned that even when it's going well, the temptation is, if it's going well, don't change it. Athletes get really superstitious about that. Like, let me just keep doing my same routine. Well, what he's learned is that if he keeps doing his same routine, the skill begins to regress. It just slowly erodes, right? And so we've learned to have a bucket of things like, okay, here's 12 things to do for the back leg. Here's 12 things we can do for the front leg. Here's something we can do for his abdominals, for his shoulder. And then as the season goes on, we just kind of intentionally mix those up. So we get the same result, but we have a new stimulus to get there.
Great. That's like some amazing result. I like it. I love it. So, um, one thing like in the book, in French Boss's book, and you also mentioned a lot is the, in the traditional strength and conditioning world, like most of the stuff is they explain it linearly, which
Mhm.
tend to not happen in human body,
Right,
right?
right.
So mm, that's I think that's it. Like that's after talking to you, I think that's like kind of like amazed me that oh, how often do we need to change the exercise? How
Mhm,
off like we really need to focus on athlete to athlete.
mhm, mhm.
And that's the
Yeah, and
thing. Sorry.
that's sort of the relationship that you establish with the player,
Yeah.
and also using your eyes. As you do it more, you begin to see that, ooh, this is getting a little stale. They're not as crisp as it was before. Maybe we need to shake it up a little bit. Um, the biomechanics and the data that we get can give us some red flags to say, wait, like in baseball, the ball flight is changing a little or something like that. A lot of times depends on the coach's experience eye to be able to go, okay. And then the relationship with the player over time, you just learn that, with Logan, we just learned over time that we have to change it constantly. Um, I know you're from Taiwan, and so one of our biggest, coolest success stories was your guy Wan Cheming, Cheming
Really?
Wang. Yeah, did you not know that? Okay, so in 2015, Chiming Wang was, a former Yankee superstar, maybe the best player to ever come out of Taiwan, right? And he came to us in 2015, kind of out of shape, older, had been out of the game for several years, throwing 80 miles an hour, had a really hard time raising his hand over his shoulder because he'd had so many surgeries and injuries. And he said to me in his Mandarin accent, I want to make it back big leagues. So we said, okay. So we got to work. He spent the whole off season with us. Um, Came in throwing 80 miles an hour, uh, left us for spring training for a non-roster invite with the Kansas City Royals, left us about 90 to 91, and then went to spring training and hit 97 and got signed and made it back to the big leagues with the Kansas City Royals. And during the time, they were filming a documentary. Frank Chen was making a movie about Chen Ming Wang, and it was a documentary about his rise and fall, but they also recorded it while they were at our place in our first tiny little 900 square foot strip mall place that we were in.
Oh,
Yeah, and and Chiming Wong made it back to the big leagues, and they made a movie about it called Late Life, the
yeah.
Chiming story, and it's on Netflix, and we're featured in it at the end of the movie. Yeah, where he had his big success, and it's a really cool story. And as a result, the CPBL hired us for 2 years in a row to come over there and train 72 coaches and 72 players for 2 years in a row, and share our ideas with them. And so that's been a really cool experience too.
Man, I'm a huge fan of him. I love
Everybody
him.
in Taiwan is,
Yeah,
yeah.
I
He's
grew
the
up
Michael
watching
Jordan of
him.
Taiwan. Yeah, he's the Michael Jordan of Taiwan. He
Yeah,
can't walk down the streets in Taipei without getting mobbed by idolizers. And so when we go over there, whenever we meet with Chen Mingguang, we have to go secretly to like back rooms of restaurants and hide because the public adores him so much. And he is just a fantastic human and a dear friend of mine. I love him a lot. Yeah.
I love him. I grew up watching. I love him. Thank you for sharing this story.
You could go find the documentary on Netflix, Late Life.
I saw it twice. I already saw it twice.
Yeah. All right. Well, then you
So
saw us. Yeah.
I know the
Yeah.
facility you said.
Yeah.
I love it.
That
I
was
love.
us. Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
There you go.
So that's basically all the question I have for you today. I'm a big fan of like Chen Ming Wong, like you mentioned. I'm a big fan of uh you guys. I'm a big fan of French Foss system, but still,
Mhm.
if people are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you? Where can they find you?
They can find us at FloridaBaseballArmory.com. I've written extensively 8 or 9 books on this kind of stuff. And also, you can call us anytime, 866-787-4533. It's easy to remember, 866 strike 3. And my business partner, Amy, will walk you through all our processes and everything. But yeah, we're right here in Lakeland, Florida. And we love working with players who are interested in reaching their dreams. And we love helping them do it. So thanks.
Thank you.
All right.